So two things. One is that I believe in entrepreneurship, which is, for me, it's about human ingenuity, human creativity, the actual doing something that is constructive in the world. We can discuss that, but essentially entrepreneurship is about taking responsibility and taking action to find certain solutions or innovations that improve our world. You could say goodness is the most important driver. That's the way I see also the work of B Corps and other companies, that whatever you do, you think about the positive impact that you have on the planet. The ultimate test of a company is to ask, how would the world be without my company? Would the world be better? Would the world be worse?
Welcome to the very first episode of the Shape the World podcast. I'm Cristi Buceceanu, moderator for Consulus Europe. We are preparing for the Shape the World Summit 2026, where we will discuss on a creative change economy. We'll feature one changemaker leader and his view of the economy and of the world at large. And there is no better person to help us launch this discussion than our guest today. He's the co-founder of B Lab Europe, the organization behind the B Corp movement. He's the co-founder and executive chair for Good Leaders and a board member for numerous organizations, all dedicated to positive change. Please welcome Marcello Palazzi.
Hi. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, Tristan. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Really, thank you for accepting it, and we are quite honored to have you here. We will start our discussion also because your name is synonymous with the B Corp movement in Europe, a movement that is really finding success in business. But before we talk about the movement or your more concrete projects, let's talk about the person, about you. At Consulus, we believe everything starts with a cause-driven, as we said before, a cause-driven leader. Marcello, let me be a little bit personal. When did it all start for you? When do you think you started caring for, let's say, generally a better world, and why?
Thank you, Chrissy. I was very lucky that at home, my father was an entrepreneur, an engineer. My grandfather was a lawyer and a judge. We often talked about either the economy, business, but also engineering. My father loved his work as engineer, hydraulic engineering, working with, eventually set up a company that worked with chemicals and paper mills and big, factories at the time. And then later we moved to environmental diagnostics together when I joined him. But at home, we often talked about ethics and the law. That's my grandfather kind of heritage. He was a judge in Venice and in Rome, and my father as an engineer. And so very soon, I ended up going to Switzerland and the UK for my studies. But when I was in the UK, I went to the London School of Economics. I was 20 or 19, 20, 21, something like that. And the economics that I was learning did not fit really with my values and the values that I had picked up at home in conversation with my father and my grandfather. And so I started looking at what I call now values-led business leaders and corporations. In the UK, we had Unilever, we had Cadbury, we had Marks and Spencer. There were quite a lot of British companies that started, say, a century earlier, who had very strong ethical values. And there, my journey started looking at family businesses, also, of course, beyond the UK, internationally, and it always was with me. And then I did my MBA, London Business School, in the late 80s. I was the only one who was, I was actually wanting business ethics on the curriculum, and it took a long time. But anyway, at least I started pushing the school to do business ethics. And then, for about 13, 14 years, I ran the side of the business from London with my father. Then in the early 90s, we sold the businesses. And I started a foundation with a Dutch friend, Paul Kloppenburg, a foundation called Progressio here in the Netherlands. I live in the Netherlands now. And we wrote 2 books together. One is Economy as the Good Ordering of Interests, which is a very different perspective from profit maximization or self-interest. And the good ordering of interest comes from Greek philosophy, Aristotle, and the self-interest and the interest of others. So for us, there was always the balance to strive that economics is actually the practice, well, it's the thought, but also the practice of combining the interest of people in a way that serves well-being for us human beings, and now, of course, 30 years later, of course, we have obviously a planetary challenge, also our planet. How do we serve the interest of the planet, which is ultimately the interest of us, because the planet doesn't really need us, but we need the planet. So it's been a long journey, but the roots were very much at the beginning. One more thing, because yours is a very important question, and to go back to the roots, the beginning of why people do things, the intent and so forth. So some years later, 2013, I was invited to spend a year at Harvard as a fellow in a program called the Advanced Leadership Institute. And I had to write a long essay about what had moved me, what had driven me to do what I have done. And I wrote an essay. I thought about it for several weeks. And then one morning I sat down, and in 3 hours I wrote the whole essay. And I entitled it Goodness, Beauty, and Truth in the Economy. And that sort of crystallized my thinking, and it's still today I think about that in a way these are the 3 existential purposes of at least Aristotelian philosophy. So goodness, we know, of course we can discuss what goodness is, but I think we know that we have an intuitive response about goodness and what is not good, what is good. Beauty is more than beauty in terms of aesthetics, and truthfulness. In the day of fake news, we know how important it is to be truthful. So those 3 could seem to be slightly abstract values, but actually they're very concrete. I use them every day. Whatever I do, I think about it. Whatever I do, say important things, I reflect. How do they express my desire for goodness, beauty, and truth? And it's actually very practical. Companies like Apple Computer is very much focused on design and beauty. Truthfulness is actually the basis of not only communication, but it's the basis of how companies interact with all the stakeholders, and that's also something very important in B Corps. When you become a B Corp, the transparency and truthfulness are very important. And goodness is really about impact. Now we talk about impact, so it's actually the positive impact that a company wants to do in the world. So these have been my drivers, and they were some years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when I got involved with the Laudato Si movement and the think tank that Pope Francis started, the Laudato Si Action Network. I was invited to join. My trilogy of goodness, beauty, and truth resonated with the teaching of the Church and the Vatican and Laudato Si and so forth. So it's actually quite simple, but quite profound as well.
Thank you, Marcello, for this beginning. We are getting warmer, let's say, right? So these are, a lot of elements, and the 3, goodness, beauty, and truthfulness. Would they summarize your cause, or is one of them which is more, appealing, or that triggered you more? How would you define, I would say, more shortly, your cause? That spark, that light that maybe from the beginning started, but then it also developed throughout the years?
So 2 things. One is that because I started early as an entrepreneur, and my grandfather on my mother's side was also an entrepreneur. So I believe in entrepreneurship, which is, for me, it's about human ingenuity, human creativity, doing something that is constructive in the world. We can discuss that, but essentially, entrepreneurship is about taking responsibility and taking action to find certain solutions or innovations that improve our world. So that for me has always been very important. So that sort of, I think it's just the superpower of humanity is that kind of entrepreneurship. At the same time, I would say of the three, and some philosophers talk about that, they say that essentially beauty and truthfulness are part of goodness. You could say goodness is the most important driver. And of course, goodness is not an easy concept. And of course, some people would disagree on what goodness is. But I think from my understanding and my practice, which, by the way, many years ago, I also worked with the Buddhist, with the Dalai Lama, and there, it's all about intention. So goodness is about intention to do something for others. It is an act of benefiting people around you from your own actions. So that's the way I see also the work of B Corps and other companies, that whatever you do, you think about the positive impact that you have on the planet. And, my colleague and good friend, Paul Polman, former CEO of Unilever, he often says the ultimate test of a company is to ask, how would the world be without my company? Would the world be better? Would the world be worse? It is, again, debatable, but, if you're selling tobacco products or drugs, clearly you're not having a positive impact on the world. And then, of course, there are different shades of impact. But essentially, my work has been about that combination of entrepreneurship, creativity, ingenuity, our superpower, with the pursuit of goodness. And I think it's actually very simple. It's not easy, but it's very simple. Sometimes we make it more difficult than it should be. We have all these measurements, ESG and blah, which of course I'm not saying they're not good, but essentially it's a simple notion, but it's not easy because that's also part of our Catholic teaching, that we get distracted. We may be, whether you believe in sin or not, but if you believe in sin, clearly we have tendencies as human beings to be driven by the opposite of virtues. It's now very important because we are in a world that these are so clearly expressed. If we look around the world with people like Putin and Netanyahu and others who are really damaging our world and the people in our world, the pursuit of goodness and virtues is very, very important.
I still want to understand more. You also said, right, the concept of goodness is so wide, and it's good to have different opinions, different side of it. In what regards goodness, also together with the B Lab or B Corp certification, there is a creative vision of how we are able to implement, right, our cause, in this case, goodness. So when everyone else saw the obstacles of shareholder primacy, B Lab saw an opportunity to redefine the entire system. How did you maintain that visionary clarity, especially when it was such an uphill battle? And what did it mean exactly to implement good, throughout these years?
Well, so two things. First of all, the discussion we've just had was about me as a person, so my own motives, which, whatever I do, I try to, I think about those motives. In terms of B Lab is a movement which I co-founded in Europe. We have partners in the United States and South America, all over the world. I think all of us, there's at least 250 people driving this movement. People say at the executive level. It's interesting. I think we all share the same view of the world. Maybe some will think about ethics more than goodness. So, there is a variety of motives. So, but the way I've seen, the way I've worked to implement this, first of all, back in the 90s, I started another movement called the Social Venture Network Europe, which was actually composed of the older generations of entrepreneurs like Ben Cohen of Ben and Jerry and Anita Roddick of The Body Shop, people like that. Inside that network, we did a project called Best Practices of Responsible Business, which mapped out about 150 practices that these companies were doing. And those best practices were used to start B Corps. B Corp went a step forward further and it said, here we have these best practices. Can we actually find a way to measure and create a holistic framework that looks at the practice of these companies and creates some sort of a theory of change using the practices that these companies were doing? So Body Shop was doing already 30 years ago, no packaging or minimum packaging. So packaging was an issue, is still an issue. Or diversity, employing people of all colors and all cultures. The Body Shop was doing this 30 years ago. So from those practices, how do you create a theory of change? So this is what we did in B Corp. On your question about, one of the questions you raised is, when I started, because we started with two founders and then I was immediately asked to be CEO. So I did a lot of work. I went to all the companies that I already knew. And in Europe, it's slightly easier than in the United States because Europe has a different model. In Germany, the social market economy. In Italy, it's more family businesses. So Europe was more suitable for that kind of philosophy of, say, looking at stakeholders and not only shareholders, looking at the interest of communities, of the planet. And this is also why now in 2025, Europe is the continent where B Corps are going faster. They're going much faster here. There's also legislation in France, in Italy, in Spain called the Benefit Corporation. It was not an uphill battle. It's of course not always easy. And, we have many, many more companies that would like to become B Corps. 50, 60,000 in Europe would like to become B Corp, but it's not so easy. The standards are quite high. That's where we are. I think that I'd say, B Corp is not a magic bullet. It is one solution for the bigger systemic issue of how do we create a more regenerative, sustainable economy.
Yeah, that's a good point. And why not? Let's tackle it now.
I've just come back from China. We were for 4 days in China. We discussed the bigger issue of system change, particularly in the light of China is doing a lot around this ecological transformation. As people know, Beijing, Shanghai, all the cars are electric, cities are very clean. They have achieved enormous progress in the last 20, 30 years. Some people don't know about that. So they have created a framework where, as obviously government is very strong in China. It is a lot of the economy is driven by government and by what people would say quite authoritarian state. But the beauty, I'm not saying that's the system I like, but the advantage, and I've seen it many years ago also in Singapore, is that when you have a fairly controlled economy and you're able to create a governing structure, it goes in a certain direction, is consistent in the direction, you can achieve things that we can't achieve in a liberal democracy where everyone is going in different directions, and it's often chaotic. To say system change, the big issue is how do we price externalities? So this is the big issue in economics, which I was already working on when I started my studies. That we have created an economic system where the cost to society and the planet are not internalized in the pricing structure. So if you look now, there's lots of studies that show that we have been depleting natural capital by the tune of, some of the studies show $20-25 trillion a year, giving a global GDP of about $110 trillion a year. So it's a lot of depletion. And over time, if you go back over time, we know from the planetary boundaries and lots of other studies that we have been losing, biodiversity. We've been losing, of course, the 9 planetary boundaries. It's a very important concept. Johan Rockström has developed this with some of us actually 20 years ago in Sweden, and 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been passed. We have overpassed those boundaries. So the system change that we need is to account for these externalities, reinvest back in nature and biodiversity, which includes it's much more than just climate, because now people like Bill Gates is saying, well, climate change is not such a big problem. Actually, it's not just climate change. It's biodiversity, it is microplastics, it is overfishing, it is acidifying the oceans, it is lots of other things. And we need to turn around the economic system to be able to reinvest and, in a way, regenerate. That's why we use the word regeneration, what we've been using and extracting. It's a very extractive economy. Now, B Corps do that mostly on their own without affecting system change. So many of these companies, like Patagonia, for example, leading B Corp, they say, we are in business to save the planet, and they do all they can within the existing systemic framework. And that's, of course, as individual companies or even as groups of companies, it's very difficult to affect system change. That requires, government changes, requires changes in the law, changes in the pricing structure, the accounting system. System change is the ultimate objective, and B Corps have contributed towards system change, but it will take more than B Corps to really affect the global system change.
These are very concrete elements on how we should tackle, the systemic change also in economy. And I would like to go back to your comparison, you were talking about China or even Singapore, about a government-led planned economy, not only, and the liberal, let's say, Western world, where you said, everybody goes on its own. And comparing also to, our proposal of economy of communion, where it might be, let's say, the middle way in between the two. So how would you translate communion, maybe in your personal experience, link it also with B Lab if you want? Yeah.
So communion is actually about giving the same weight to all of the stakeholders, employees, customers, society. Being in communion means that we give equal respect and equal rights and equal opportunities to all the stakeholders. So it is, going back to the book that I wrote before Kloppenburg about economy as the good ordering of interests. It means meeting the interest of all the stakeholders in a communitarian or communion way. So this is how my interpretation would be. The second thing is, of course, we are very far away from achieving, but I think that the three fundamental pillars of our economy is citizenship, ownership, and leadership. So on ownership, communion strategy will tend towards more distributed ownership. Not necessarily as a panacea, it doesn't always work, and there are other ways. For example, Patagonia is not owned by everybody, but it's owned by a trust, and the trust is basically owned by the planet. Also, Yvonne Chouinard of Patagonia said it, our company is owned by the planet. That is a way for me of being in communion with everyone else and also with the planet. And there are movements like stewardship owned companies, in Denmark, Sweden, Germany, there are quite a lot of companies that are owned by a foundation. It's the same, it's a similar principle. It's a principle of stewardship. Stewardship in the longer term for the benefit of, the world around us. That's very different than the more kind of, I would say, North American way of profit maximization, shareholder primacy, which unfortunately has become more and more of an issue with some of these huge companies that are worth trillions of dollars and are owned by shareholders who do not have that kind of accountability that I think we need in the world. That's a few reflections on communion, and it can go very far. So some of the highest scoring B Corps are, in a way, in the spirit of communion, owned by the people, governed in the benefit of the interest of all the stakeholders. Ultimately, it's about giving human beings and also the planet an equal voice in how we organize our economic life.
This is also one of our main results, main observations also during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, which we went through recently. And it goes towards what we called culture of trust. This culture of trust, and I observed well the difference between shareholders and stakeholders and putting, the same importance to all the stakeholders, right? So this culture of trust, it is built internally among the team, but also initially and throughout externally with a group of friends, the mentors of the leader, going to the clients, supply chain, and so on. So we've observed that, as you said, right, companies that have a high level of culture of trust among all the stakeholders are able to resist, are able to be more resilient, and be more innovative, and so on, right? In your personal experience, how did you build this culture of trust, not just internally but also external? So what were your, for example, first group, telling us about your friend and so on? So how did those relationship helped you to bring along the B Lab, and then all the activities project that you are bringing along?
It connects with communion. So in a way, communion, in my understanding, and in this, by the way, the word company means breaking bread together, which, it's fine for us Catholic Christians, but if you are a Buddhist, we'll define in a different way, but it's the same principle, no?
Right.
The same principle is that sort of, which is all faiths, all religions, and even people who are not faithful, but who have ethical values. We start from the assumption that human beings are one. There is oneness, there's unity in the world, So, maybe to say we are all brothers and sisters for some people is a bit too much, but it's expressed as a sort of human family. We are one human family. It is sort of togetherness, And by the way, now that we have these global challenges of climate, of inequalities, of war instead of peace, oneness really fundamental. So to strive towards the kind of oneness. So oneness, unity, very strong in faiths like the Baha'i faith, for example. Unity means we are one. We are in this together as one human family. And therefore, if you believe in that at the global level, then clearly the microcosm is the organizations inside the globe. And so the organization, if you want to have oneness in the world, you have to have oneness in the organization. So it's a kind of fractal system, I have actually a Norwegian friend who often, he had a beautiful company called Skull Tech. I think his children are now running it, but he had a very simple sort of set of principles that, peace starts with yourself and then goes to the village and then goes to the city and then goes to the world, So in that sense, unity, oneness has to work at all these levels. So if we believe in that, then clearly a company, an enterprise, and of course we've become a world of companies because this is very different actually. Even 30, 40 years ago, it was not so prevalent, As Peter Drucker says, we've become a society organization. So organizations are actually the entities that run the world, of course, together with government. But, 200 years ago, before industrialization, basically governments and principalities run everything. And now it's much more decentralized. There's a lot to be said about that. But so to your question, communion, oneness, unity, they are very, very truthful, very real, concrete manifestations that need to be ingrained in the economy and in organizations if we want to be consistent with the values that we aspire. So this is also very important for me to say that trust is about truthfulness as well, so that goes back to goodness, beauty, and truth. And then, of course, in practice, it generally means, it's the same for me as what we said earlier, that the good ordering of interest means you're caring for others, not just for yourself. And therefore, if you care for others, you automatically give others your trust. By giving others your trust, you sort of elicit trust from them. Of course, it doesn't always work, and there are a lot of villains in this world, so we have to be careful about it. But that's, of course, that could be one of the biggest challenges. How can you be good in a world that is not good? But I mean, that becomes a longer discussion, but maybe we can have that if you wish.
Yeah. So this, I would say, it brings us to our 4C, which we called competent pivot. Because on one side, as you say, there's a bit of a challenge to overcome mistrust, right, that comes from the others. But at the same time, pivot is crucial in our economy, right? So the whole economic system, as you said, in the US, we see it otherwise. All the challenges that come with, in China, we see it otherwise. So the connection between the multiple economic models bring a lot of challenges for companies today. So, for example, how did you see that B Corp movement and the companies within it adapt to all these challenges, right? 2008 financial crisis, then COVID, then all these economic models. How do we adapt with it?
So we also done some studies. We talk about resilience. A company that is successful is by definition a resilient company. You have to overcome and succeed in dealing with all the shocks and the uncertainties and nowadays, of course, we live in a very uncertain moment. Resilience is very important. And what we have seen, what we have studied and can show is that when a company is in a way caring for stakeholders, for the planet, you create a culture that it goes deep into, you create an engagement. People are engaged, they work together for the same purpose. In a way, they stay with each other, even under very difficult circumstances. So during the financial crisis and later with COVID, we have seen that B Corps were generally up to 30% more successful than other companies. When the going gets tough, in a normal company, people leave, they start cooking the books and, doing things that they shouldn't be doing. But in a B Corp, people stay with each other. They stick. They are basically, there is a purpose that drives them to be together. And this is this is not rocket science. I remember studying the Japanese company Mitsubishi 30 years ago. Mitsubishi was at that time a very purpose-driven company where there was a real ethos in the company. In those days, Mitsubishi had employees for life. You started working there, you work in Mitsubishi all your life, and sometimes your children would work in Mitsubishi. So there used to be an engagement, a trust-based engagement that was like a family breaking bread together, which of course, it may still exist in some family businesses and corporates, but it's the shareholder primacy, putting profit above everything else, has corrupted the culture. I think we have moved to a different paradigm. That's partly what B Corps are trying to do, is to revive the paradigm of togetherness, purpose-driven, everyone working for the same, or at least for a shared purpose, brings human beings together much more closely than just profit,
Amazing. Yeah. So you basically created a conclusion for our discussion, bringing together purposefulness, cause-driven organizations, creative vision. How do we implement concretely cause together with our stakeholders? Then the culture of trust and competently pivoting when, let's say, the weather is not as we expected. And all of this, help us exactly shaping a better world. Really, thank you for your insights, for your personal experiences that you brought in the discussion. I would have like a last curiosity, right? What would your advice be for a younger entrepreneur, for example, or for companies which are already established? What is the advice for them to better shape the world today?
So I think that it's a mirror of something you asked earlier. If you really, in a way, capture is not the right word, but if you channel human energy towards a shared purpose, meaning if people are fully engaged, they believe and they trust that they're working in an organization, a company that will do all it can also for its people. So the people are really, we often say, we don't mean it, people are most important asset. But obviously, clearly, if you believe in what we've been saying now about unity, about togetherness, people are the most important asset. So if a company is able to have that kind of culture, you will have so much more capacity and intelligence and competence than normal companies have. The other day, someone told me in the United States, rate or ratio of engagement is around 30%. In Europe, it is even less. So in a normal company, it means 70% or more people are not really engaged. They just work because they have to earn the money. It's just a job, People would like to work in a company that engages them 100%, or maybe not everyone, but in general, many people would be, which is, by the way, this is one of the, not using this parallel for any other reason, to say, when you have emergency situation, like, countries have to go to war, or they have to, fight for against climatic issues, you get really people engaged, and there is a mission that brings people together. And that kind of mission is what ideally one wants to develop in all companies. So my kind of tip, my advice is, unfortunately, there's still leaders who don't believe in that. In management theory, there was always theory X and theory Y. Theory X is where you work like you make people work like slaves. You basically just, that kind of culture. And theory Y is a belief in the human spirit and in the engagement of people. So, of course, I believe in theory Y. I mean, I believe in that intrinsically and intuitively. But certainly in our economy today, it's not about human power, physical power. It's about mental power. It's about engagement. So my tip is to be able to run an organization in that way of fully engaging people is, of course, ultimately what you want for people. It's about human development. It's about giving people life chances. And at the same time, it's very good for business because you are much more successful as an organization. It's not easy. And of course, not just business, but life is challenging. Life is tough. And so you may face situations like, take a company like Sony, or Nokia. You get into a place where your market is wiped out because Apple has come onto the market. So what do you do? So sometimes you can't. Sometimes you have to reduce your cost. You have to dismiss employees and so forth. But you have to do it in a certain way that respect the individuals. And if you do that, I think you get basically best of both worlds. So that's what I would say. The other thing I would say is I sometimes have a slide on my presentation and I show the Dalai Lama and Steve Jobs. And I say, well, actually, you have to be both. You have to be as good as entrepreneur as Steve Jobs and as, say, caring as the Dalai Lama, compassionate. It's not so easy to be the Dalai Lama and Steve Jobs at once, Or you can make other comparisons, I call it the ambidextrous leadership. You got to be both good on both sides. Good, very entrepreneurially, very also clever, smart, at the same time, compassionate and caring. And combining those two, I think, in my eyes, gives the best outcome.
That's a powerful and perfect image and also challenge, right? For all of us to end with this discussion or to, start another reflection for us later on. Marcello, thank you for your time and for the incredible work, that you do.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was a pleasure. Very, very, very nice to be with you. And congratulations for your work. Best wishes for your next steps.
That was Marcello Palazzi, co-founder of B Lab Europe. He showed us that building an economy of communion isn't just a theory, it's a practical, achievable reality. Join us next time on the Shape the World Summit podcast as we meet another leader who is designing a better future. Until then, visit conslus.com to learn more about how you can shape our world.